Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Japanese Politics 101 room. Every Sunday, Timothy Langley, who runs a company in Tokyo that focuses exclusively on Japanese politics, government and public affairs, and host Pai Matsuoka, bring to you the latest developments in Japanese politics. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thanks everybody for joining us. I know it's the day after Christmas, and I look at the people who are on the room, and I'm just really so honored to have people of such great foundation in what's going on in Japan and business and economics and politics, and I'm always compelled by that, and I'm always motivated to try and bring you relevant information that's important to each of us in our various interactions with, living and dealing with this country and reporting to clients and colleagues. So I try and keep it as snappy as possible and open it up to discussion after briefing you for about 20 or 30 minutes. But I don't have all the answers, so Maya keeps saying, questions and answers. I'm just a reporter, and hopefully this platform just helps us all talk about issues of concern and raise issues up that I can maybe dive into and report to you on a later room. But we've been going strong, 46 consecutive rooms. That's pretty significant, and I really appreciate Maya for bossing this into shape and making us continue it for such a long continuous time. So I'd like to get started. Last week we closed up with the supplementary budget, and it was in process. It had not passed the Diet, and a week later it has passed as predicted, and it passed basically as it was presented to the upper house. Sorry, it went from the upper house to the lower house, and it was passed last week. It is, by all descriptions, the largest extra budget to come out of the parliament, and it is in response to COVID. So it's a fund that is developed to be used before the end of the fiscal year. It's a record 36 trillion yen, which is about $320 billion, and it's mostly for financing the latest economic package to get the economy back on track. So some of it is for energizing the economy, and some of it is for anticipation or preparation for what they expect might be another wave. We're going through something of a Omicron bloom right now. I don't know how long that's going to be, but it is pretty serious. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But with regard to the budget, there will be what many consider to be lavish spending up until March to kind of prioritize what the Prime Minister has promoted as his new economic package, the new capitalism, and putting the kind of fiscal health of the country a little bit on the back burner. So you might remember that there was the discussion and a little bit of the slapping down by the Ministry of Finance that you can't energize the economy by pushing money into it without having the economy generate the money first. And he came with, we need to raise wages, we need to make this a beautiful country for people to live in, and we need to decrease the disparity between the wealthy and the not so wealthy, or actually the poor. And he had a bit of a battle there. It looks like he won that battle, and the Ministry of Finance has allocated funds so that he can pay people more, develop social programs, and then force the economy to generate that through taxes and bonds, which they'll have to do. So the government will have to generate new bonds worth 22 trillion to cover most of the supplementary budget, and the outstanding balance of that, the 36 trillion yen, will come out of government bonds and tax revenue. So similarly to what's going on in the United States with the Biden administration, Build Back Better, and how are you going to pay for that? And it's not going to cost a single yen. That sort of thing. It does come out of taxes. So there's anticipated to be between now and in March or April a lot of money in the economy, and a little bit of relief for example, even in Go To Travel, that there's a large amount of money earmarked for that. So they're anticipating, even though COVID or variants might come in to close the borders from time to time, they're preparing for that so that the economy doesn't take as much of a hit, and they get go-to travel up and running. And they have the stimulus package for all of these companies and restaurants and travel agencies, particularly the travel agencies, to be in the black again. Everybody's bleeding cash because of the COVID, and so that is the strategy here. Let's goose the economy. Let's pump the money in, and let's try and get the economy up and running. So you can anticipate, with this much money in the economy, you can anticipate going into January, February, March, a lot of things coming up that should prop up the economy. So that's with the supplemental budget. They passed the budget, and then they closed down the House. So now, with regard to what's going on within the diet will stay closed until the 11th of January. There are other things that are going on. There are various, trips abroad, meetings of defense ministries and things like that. But at least for diet deliberations, the session has closed. It was an extraordinary diet just for discussing the budget. And so people are back in their constituencies. They're, preparing for New Year's holidays, kissing babies and that sort of thing. And then they'll come back to Tokyo on January 11th. And then it'll be a 150-day session. So that's the standard diet session. It happens every year. It is in the Constitution that this has to happen 150 days. And that brings us into spring. And then the House closes down. We move into elections for the upper house. So that's the pattern that's coming up, 150 days, maybe 4 months or so, and then the upper house. So even as we move into mid to late January, you'll start hearing signs, seeing signs and hearing more and more about the upper house election. So be prepared for that. I'd like to move on to what Mr. Kishida has decided to do about Japan's representation at the Olympics. They have made a decision. It is in line with what the United States wants. They're not sending any cabinet ministers. They are sending 3 individuals, the Japan Olympic Committee president, the organizing committee for the Tokyo Olympic Games, and the president of that, and then the Japan Paralympic Committee president. Those 3 individuals are going as the most senior representatives. None of them have ministerial portfolios. One of them is in the upper house, Hashimoto Seiko. She's the organizing committee chairperson of the Tokyo Olympic Games. But her role is for the Tokyo Olympic Games organizing committee, not as a member of the parliament. So they've made that distinction. This represents or resembles most of the response that the group of 7 have given, that they're not going to send official representation to Beijing. The Olympics start in February, so it's right around the corner. Let me see, there's Korea is responding with full diplomatic contingencies. They will be going and representing, and the reason for that is because they're so close to China, and they rely on the relationship with China to mollify this relationship they have with North Korea, very tenuous. So they're going their own way there, or I should say they're not going the way of the United States and some of their more important allies. And importantly, France is not going along with the United States either. And the reason for that is that they are sponsoring the Olympics. It's their turn in 2024. It's in Paris. So they don't want to make things upset. So they will be sending, a full diplomatic contingent and representing themselves there. So that decision has been made. It's somewhat important because the signals between, how diplomacy is worked. The companies send signals to their counterparts, just as China is sending signals to Hong Kong about coming down hard on what their freedom of speech is and how they refer to the Tiananmen incident. So there's a lot of that signaling that's going on, and this is one of them. So the Olympics are big for China. The fact that we have this flare-up of the variant is huge. China is in a lockdown now. So there is a lot of consternation going on about how the Olympics will go, how the Chinese will be able to roll that out. They've spent a lot of money on it. It is a very important public relations initiative for them in light of everything else that's going on with the Taiwan Straits and how they're dealing with some of the countries like Lithuania, who has acknowledged Taiwan, and now they're getting slapped around pretty hard. So there's a lot of that. I'd like to move on to the variant that has flared up out of South Africa, the Omicron variant. It has exploded in the United States. There are, as far as I recall, please correct me if I'm wrong, maybe 39, or it might have even exceeded 40 cases in Japan. One of them just kind of came up out of nowhere. They chased it down to see how it was started, how this person could have gotten infected. And they're scratching their heads wondering how somebody could have been infected like that. So that is beginning to pick up a little bit of speed. There's also this issue with the Americans in Okinawa at Camp Hansen and Camp Schwab, who have had clusters coming up. And then it was reported that since September, the United States military has not been required to take tests when they come into Japan. So they take their PCR test when they're in the United States or wherever else, because the soldiers come from all over the world. And when they land in Okinawa, that's the end of it. They don't get tested, they don't get put under a strict quarantine. But they are dealt with under a certain set of rules and regulations. They don't have to follow what the Japanese do at Narita. They're under a special arrangement called the Status of Forces Agreement between the United States and Japan. And so they do things their own way. Probably if they had to do things the way the Japanese are doing it, the administration of that would just be so burdensome, and probably something that the United States government would have to pay for, since it's not in the agreement of status of forces who pays for what. So that revelation came out this week that since there was a flare-up, it's disclosed because many of the soldiers, they come into Okinawa, they're working on base, and if they're bringing in the variant, it happens pretty frequently. It happened earlier in the year when a bunch of people, one of the Marine bases had a barbecue out on the beach in the public area, and there was something of a cluster that started as a consequence of that. So the Japanese government is watching very carefully and trying to monitor that, but there's only so much that they can do. It's like one of the Marines get into trouble with a burglary or smuggling drugs or raping somebody. The Japanese police and the military police, they have this tug of war over that sort of thing happening. And similarly with the treatment of COVID, this is starting to become a bit of an issue between the United States and Japan. So it's something to keep an eye on. While we're talking about Okinawa, the defense of the coverage that the United States provides for the protection of the Japanese islands, there's a lot going on in that area too, as you can imagine. Part of it is political and concerns the Japanese treatment of Article 9 of the Constitution and the restrictions on having offensive capabilities. And so this relationship that the Japanese have to have with the United States, that we can't do the offensive stuff, but you can do the offensive stuff because that's not covered in the Constitution. But in exchange for that, we will do other things. So one of the other things, quote, finger quotes, the other things is paying for the stationing of troops in Japan, mostly in Okinawa. So this Okinawa thing comes up pretty frequently in our discussions here. Okinawa stages or hosts about 55,000 U.S. troops and their families in Okinawa. There are other air bases and other facilities throughout Japan, but about more than 90% of the U.S. presence is focused in Okinawa. So I mentioned earlier about the Status of Forces Agreement that kind of determines and guides how the Japanese and the U.S. military deal with one another. Passports being one issue, and how they pay for the stationing of troops. So typically they have a 10-year budget. The budget for what the Japanese government is going to pay for stationing of the troops, it goes under a 10-year review every 10 years. That was supposed to come up last year, and because of COVID, it didn't come up. And so they just kind of grandfathered. They did what they were doing the year earlier, even though the budget didn't accommodate that. So they have to do catch up. And so they just finished this catch up. It's not something we've spent a lot of time talking about, but it is somewhat important. They just finished this catch up over this last couple of weeks, and they resolved it this last week that we just finished. And it is also included in the budget. So that's one of the reasons why it was concluded. But with the payment of some of the fees and the employment of Japanese nationals who work on base, This 10-year term increased by 11% this year and moving forward. So it's a pretty big amount of money. It's over a period of 10 years, it's about $268 billion that the Japanese pay for hosting the United States here. That's a lot of money, and it's earmarked for defense capabilities. And you might remember that the Russian and the Chinese Navy flotilla went through the Tsugaru Straits in maybe September or July, and it caused a lot of problems, not problems, it caused a lot of concern because never before had the Russians and the Chinese cooperated in a military exercise like this, a naval exercise actually going through the straits. The straits are very narrow there. Typically, Japan has a 12 nautical mile border where the Japanese sovereignty extends, and that's usually acknowledged throughout the world for most countries. The Chinese acknowledge something far greater, but at least for Japan, it's 12 nautical miles. Between the straits there, Hokkaido and Honshu are separated by less than 18 miles. So that border between international waters needs to decrease. So the flotilla went through the straits within sight of land from Hokkaido and also from northern Kyushu. So this is, it's once again raising up this temperature. It's not quite rattling swords, but it suggests rattling swords, and the Chinese seem to be very, very good at that. So this defense increase for the United States and this strategy of bolstering the southern islands, not just Okinawa, but in anticipation of perhaps something happening in the straits around Taiwan, is a very big and very real issue for the United States. And it also encourages the Japanese Navy to participate on a more active basis too. So once again, we start the diet on the 11th, and you can anticipate that the revision of the Constitution is going to be coming up in this diet session. Probably a referendum for considering a revision of the Constitution being submitted in this diet session, in this 150-day diet session. So please keep an eye on that as well. Things are really starting to come up. In fact, the Russians complained bitterly just this last week about the U.S.-Japan joint exercises. If you can, the kettle calling the pot black, or however that kotowaza goes. But the Russians called in the Japanese ambassador this last week in Moscow to complain about these joint exercises going on. You might have heard also that the Ministry of Defense reported about this hack that occurred and what they're doing about it. It reached the news this last week that they have released some of the information about the hack that occurred. But it's strange that the hack occurred almost a year ago in January with Mitsubishi Electric, and they were hacked, and 20,000 files were compromised. We find out only now, a year later, 11 months later, really what happened there, and they're starting to talk about it. But obviously, this hack causes, the reason why it was Mitsubishi Electric is because Mitsubishi Electric does a lot of defense contracting. They do guided missiles, they do nuclear reactors, they do a lot of different things. It's a huge conglomerate, and the suspicion is that this was through China. So what's going on here is that there's some insecurity felt by the United States about sharing sensitive military information with Japan, their ally, because of the lack of security. So causing this kind of insecurity among the United States with regard to their ally is one of the strategic imperatives of China, so that it stymies the development and the coordination that would ordinarily go on. So this strategy is broad-based. It infects all sorts of different aspects of the U.S.-Japan relationship, and also Japan's relationship with Taiwan, with South Korea, with Vietnam. So it's something that comes up. It is almost never in isolation. It is almost never just a coincidence that some of these things go on. So when these issues come up, just keep in the back of your mind what it could mean for the revision of the Constitution, because this is a huge issue. You'll notice also that the Japan Democratic Party, the People's Democratic Party, It's one of the smaller political parties. It's an opposition party. It's not a member of the LDP, but it is somewhat affiliated with the concerns that the LDP famously champions. And one of those is the revision of the Constitution. And you will have noticed that they're becoming a little bit more vocal about being somewhat right-wing, because they can see that the winds are moving in that direction, and being in somewhat of a coalition with the LDP always produces benefits, either benefits in terms of posts or maybe even cabinet portfolios, although those are the choicest of the lot. But they are beginning to emerge, as is Ishin. So these political forces that visibly, vocally are lobbying and talking about and espousing in these political faction parties that I attend way too many of, about the revision of the Constitution, will begin to pick up more and more speed. So keep your eye open for that, because the more that comes up, the more it tells you that the environment is being prepared for something to come up probably in April or May. Okinawa, in the budget that was just passed, we talked a little bit about Okinawa last week, and the governor there, Denny Tamaki, who was in the lower house here and then ran for governor. And he is opposed to the resituation of the Marine base from Futima to Henoko. It's been in the news a lot. They're just dumping land into the peninsula to create a huge landing pad and footprint where there was formerly water. And they're going through revisions of the construction plan that requires the Okinawan government to approve that, and he is fighting that. And so what they did in punishment for that is, in this budget that they just passed, the supplemental budget, they've reduced the funding for development of Okinawa by 11%. It's a slap in the face to the current governor. And what they're telling him is, you need to toe the line. And if you don't toe the line, you will suffer retribution from Tokyo. And that's how this is played. That's how this politics is practiced. The governor goes up for election this summer, and they don't want him to be governor anymore. He's very popular in Okinawa, but this fight, the LDP will obviously put up somebody who has good, strong Tokyo experience, perhaps maybe a bureaucrat or a former member of the Diet. It will be a fight, a very strongly fought fight. And if they are successful in dislodging Tamaki Sensei, then the LDP will have their guy there. The fundings will flourish once again, and they will revise the construction profile of the Henoko base. It's been going on for so long. It's just what a thorn in the side for the United States and for the United States-Japan relationship, that they need to expand. They need to have better facilities. They need to update their facilities. But in Okinawa, they're strained. They're saying, look, we support all of this, but we just get pushed around. We're the poorest of all prefectures. We could use a little bit more help from the central government. Why don't we make Japan a paradise? Why don't we make Japan, Okinawa like the Hawaii of Japan? It hasn't been done. It doesn't seem like there's even really been put a lot of effort into doing that. It costs almost as much to fly from Tokyo to Naha in Okinawa as it does to fly from Tokyo to any place else in Southeast Asia. So the attractiveness of traveling to Okinawa as a tourist, there are other options. It just doesn't make sense if Okinawa is of a higher priority. So that is also something that we need to keep a tight lookout for. Last week, shifting gears here, I failed to mention the United States Senate had approved a raft of new ambassadors. It was under a lot of fighting. The Senate approves ambassadorial positions that are recommended by the president. He's under the gun with his Build Back Better, and a lot of the opposition is revealed in the acknowledgement of the Senate of the appointees for ambassadorship. President Bush had the same problem. You might remember that he couldn't appoint ambassadors for the longest period of time. And the same thing is happening with President Biden. But they finally passed a large list of ambassadors. One of them was Caroline Kennedy, you might have heard, who is appointed as ambassador to Australia. But also Japan received the approval of Rahm Emanuel, formerly chief of staff under the Obama administration, and a mayor of Chicago too, famously. So he is approved as the ambassador to Japan. There's a lot of fanfare going on about that. It is unknown when he will travel here. I predict it'll probably be in the summer or towards the fall. He is being briefed and prepared for that position now. It's going to be a hard position for him, not only because of his reputation, but also just the fact of the ambassadors, what their role is in current diplomacy these days. The prime minister and his administration is much better connected to Washington, D.C. directly rather than relying on the position of the embassy or the ambassador. They do fill a very important role, but it's just not as critical as it once was. In any event, Rahm Emanuel is coming with a bit of a reputation and a bit of an agenda. So when he was passed, you might remember the earlier ambassador, William Hagerty. He was appointed by Bush. He served only a brief, less than about 2 years of his term, and then he left to run for the Senate. He won that Senate seat. But it was a little bit premature for him to leave. People don't understand the story of why he left so prematurely. And it wasn't because that Senate seat was open. It was because of things that happened within the Trump administration that required him to recuse himself from this position because it became untenable to him and damaged his standing as a potential Senate candidate as well. So he had to give up the ghost. And as a result, Japan didn't have an ambassador from that point until now. So it's almost been 3 years. In any event, when Bill Hagerty was appointed, the Senate voted overwhelmingly for him. He had Democratic support. He had Republican support. He had some people who didn't vote for him because he didn't have a whole lot of diplomatic experience, but he did have Japan experience. With Rahm Emanuel, it's a little bit different. They had maybe 69 people in the Senate that voted. So very few people. They did have a quorum, but he only received 48 of those votes. So it's a majority of the votes who were there, who were present, but it's not a resounding vote. And he had a lot of detractors also in the Democratic Party too. So being able to be a direct mouthpiece to the president, to the administration, and also having a strong footprint is not going to be his calling card here. And with regard to his marching orders, I've heard that he is committed to getting Greg Kelly released from a detention from prison. He's still in the case is still being heard on the Carlos Ghosn scandal, of which Greg Kelly was the lawyer in that case. So Greg Kelly and Carlos Ghosn were arrested at the same time. But I've heard that one of his marching orders is to protect American citizens in Japan in business, and that's top on his list of things to do. It happens pretty frequently when a new executive or a CEO comes to town. They're full of vim and vinegar, and they want to get things done. They don't quite understand the lay of the land too much, but they come in and they want to score some hits pretty quickly. I imagine he'll be successful in doing those things that he wants to do because the Japanese administration, the Kishida administration, and members of the various bureaucracies want to maintain that relationship with the United States. But that veneer is very, very thin and doesn't last very long. So sometimes there's political capital that has to be spent. So it is going to be interesting how that plays out. The most important thing now to know is, when he will come here, he will obviously occupy the residence in Akasaka. So you can expect that there will be hopefully a flourishing of social and business events that involve the new ambassador. It's just been too long since we've had that. Speaking of being politically engaged, we talked a little bit about the municipality of Machinino having a referendum to allow foreigners to vote in referendums that are brought to the table there. And that vote was defeated last week. I don't know if it's strange, but the LDP was against it. The Constitutional Democratic Party was for it, but the vote was very tight and it didn't pass. What this required was what this involved was a ballot so that the foreigners who live in the municipality can vote on referendums that are brought up. There are two municipalities that allow that for foreigners to come in, Zushi and Toyonaka in Osaka. They allow foreigners who have been there, who are not necessarily permanent residents, to vote on referendum. there are, about 40 other municipalities that allow foreigners some form of participation, but they have requirements that you either have to be a permanent resident or you have to have been in the municipality for a certain period of time. There are some stipulations there, but there is this movement of trying to accommodate the foreigners into the political process here. That particular one did not pass, but the mayor has said that she's going to continue to pursue that. So it's not a completely dead issue. There's probably people in the audience who want to talk a little bit more about that. So let's just leave that for the Q&A. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on with Mr. Kishida and Mr. Abe. Mr. Abe, as you know, is the leader of the largest political faction. And the reason why he became the leader was because the former leader, Hosokawa, was elevated to the president, the Speaker of the House. So he is the top person in the lower house. He's the one that sits in the throne and has the gavel, and all of the hearings go on under his administration. And so he had to give up his position as the head of the Abe faction, thereby allowing Mr. Abe to be the head of the faction. This is important in a couple of different ways. The one that I want to talk about now is that, well, first of all, you've got Mr. Abe. There was a group. It was Abe, Hayashi, Kishida, and Motegi, Mr. Aso thrown in there as well, who kind of helped Mr. Kishida get elected. They're kind of the power center of gravity. And we've only been through this election just less than 2 months now. And this center of gravity is becoming a little bit more centralized. And through centrifugal force, Mr. Abe has been kind of moved out, even though he controls the largest faction. So right now you've got Kishida, Motegi, and Aso, who are meeting from time to time to talk about, the dynamics of politics and spending money and who gets to do what. And Mr. Abe is not invited. So this fight, the reason for this fight is because Mr. Hayashi, who is number 2 in Mr. Kishida's faction, sits in an election district that's contiguous to Mr. Abe's election district. The Supreme Court has said in that particular district in Yamaguchi, where it's a very rural area, a lot of the population has declined over time because the young people don't want to do the farming. They don't want to stay in the sticks. They want to go to the big cities. So the younger people have moved on to Osaka or Fukuoka or even Tokyo. And so the number of voters required to elect a member of the House has diminished, and the Supreme Court has even said it is in a state of unconstitutionality. So you have to fix it. You have to gerrymander it so that the person's vote in Tokyo carries as much weight as the person's vote in Yamaguchi. So they've gone through a gerrymandering process where the lower populated districts coalesce their boundaries, and some of the more populated places, like in Tokyo, they get another person. They don't expand the boundaries. They just get another representative. So there are about 6 districts that are going to be losing a member of the parliament by coalescing districts, and there are going to be similarly about 6 districts that increase. So the number of members of the parliament stays the same. It's just the distribution is different. And Mr. Hayashi and Mr. Abe are confronted with the prospect of running against each other, and one of them has to give up the ghost. So that means that either as a former prime minister, you've lost your election to somebody who is the current foreign minister, or the current foreign minister loses his seat to Mr. Abe, who was the longest serving prime minister. And now what are you going to do? He's the foreign minister and he's not a member of the parliament. How does that work? Or if you're Mr. Abe, you run the largest political faction and you're not a member of the Diet, how does that work? So that is becoming a major issue. And this is where Mr. Hosokawa comes in as Speaker of the House. So now, just over this last week, there has been a discussion about, isn't it somewhat unfair that the people in Yamaguchi, their voice is not being heard in the central government? And it's probably because, the representatives, the number of representatives there is not enough. So now Mr. Hosokawa is getting into a little bit of trouble because the Supreme Court has said you need to reduce the number there so that one person's vote in Yamaguchi carries as much weight as somebody's vote in Tokyo. And Mr. Hosokawa, as the Speaker of the House, has voiced a concern about Yamaguchi that benefits Mr. Abe, if you follow my logic here. So this is heating up to be a big fight. And the other thing that came up, there are two really popular magazines, rags in Japan, that carry a lot of political weight. One is Bunshin, and one is Shincho. Shincho reported this last week about election irregularities in the Hayashi campaign. You might remember Hayashi was a member of the upper house. He resigned from the upper house in order to run for the lower house when the lower house election was called. And he did that because he eventually wants to become prime minister. The prime minister is always elected from the lower house. And also his best friend is going to become prime minister first. So you've got that going on. So this dynamic with Mr. Hayashi as the foreign minister, it was reported in Shincho that there was some funny things going on with the money and illegal campaign contributions and that sort of thing. Apparently this story was leaked to Shincho. They did an investigative report on it, possibly by the enemies of the Hayashi campaign, which are the Abeites. So this fight now is already beginning. You can see the rumblings of it, and it's somewhat under the blankets. You would not have heard of it had you not been in this room. But as we move into February, March, April, things like this are going to become more topical. They're going to be talked about in the newspaper. There's going to be, black stories about Mr. Abe, about, Sakura Mirukai or whatever, and also different stories about Hayashi. So this fight is looking like it's going to be a big fight. There are, I think with Mr. Hosokawa, he wants to prevent that. So I think he would like to kick the ball down the path so that the LDP is not damaged as a result, because both of these people are very influential within the LDP. So it's one of those fights that you don't want to see, you want to avoid if you can. But what the Supreme Court said, fix it. And I don't know if Mr. Hosokawa, as the the Speaker of the House, has that kind of ability, but it will cause a lot of consternation. I've gone on long enough, and I appreciate you listening. I'd like to open the floor. Please come up, because if you don't, you know how much Maya loves to pummel me with these questions. So thank you very much, everybody. Maya?
I'm lost for words, actually. But anyway, you mentioned that the supplementary budget has been voted, and once again we see an increase. And also in the news, there is some talk about the budget for the next fiscal year, which starts on the 1st of April, and it's once again a record high budget. And what is interesting to me is that there is no debate, there is no discussion about the increase of the budget again. So it's like, Japan, financially, obviously the Japanese government has one of the, or maybe this is the biggest debt, internal debt among the major economies in the world. And yet nobody actually questions the increase in the budget. So do you think that this has something to do with, the politicians waiting for the upper house election to happen? And do you think that this is going to change? This lack of discussion, is it going to change after the upper house election next year?
Yes, what you say about the deficit, the Japanese national deficit, is far surpasses anything that any of the other advanced G20 countries have. It is truly astounding, but they seem to be keeping on top of it. I think the reason why you're not hearing a lot of discussion about it is because the LDP holds such a strong position within the Diet. And apparently there are retributions to be held if you don't sing the right song. A certain amount of discussion is entertained and managed, but when you step over the line, then all of a sudden the knives come out. So I think that's probably why the LDP is in firm control of the economy. They point, the prime minister appoints the Bank of Japan head. His term comes up next year. But also the Minister of Finance is, it's just a long line of Mr. Aso, Mr. Aso, Mr. Aso. So I think they have a firm grasp on that, and they just keep producing bonds and hoping that the economy takes off. So I don't know if that really responds to the question. Maybe if somebody in the audience has better insight into that, but I think it's just pretty much, standard practice. We see this all the time here.
Well, I mean, because it's interesting. The other day, I was talking with somebody who is in the financial, finance industry here, and they were saying that there is a lot of cash flowing around because, the Bank of Japan
Yep.
keeps printing money, but at the same time, the national debt is increasing. So it's really, to me, as a layperson, of course. I mean, I'm not into politics that much. It's how can I put it, really fascinating to see how
Yes.
things are happening, right?
Yes, it is. It is still a period of relatively free cash. You can go and get bank loans that are, it's you borrow 100 and you pay back 100. It's not like you're paying plus interest. It is very low interest rates, and that the banks are encouraging companies, and Japanese companies are highly leveraged, so their debt to profitability is very high. But they're encouraged to borrow money, and the Japanese banks are very generous in acknowledging the money that they get. So that's one of the important ways that the Japanese government pumps money into the economy. Is if you have a corporation and your company, you don't even have to be in existence for very long. You have a business plan, you have a formal office, you've been doing business for maybe 10 months, you haven't even turned a profit yet. You can qualify for bank loans of 5 million 10 million yen relatively easily, and so that helps you generate hire more people, potentially generate a revenue stream quicker than what your business plan allocated. So that's one of the best ways of energizing the economy. So you will see a lot more of that going forward, I think.
Yes, it's interesting because obviously the startup system, there is a lot of hype in this environment at the moment. But also,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, they're talking about inflation and that, the government needs to think about it. At the same time, a lot of people are saying that, yes, the banks, they're readily giving loans to companies, and the companies are borrowing money. And at the same time, of course, the salaries keep
Flat.
stagnated.
Yeah.
They keep flat. So
So
it's,
there are two kind of strategies that are going on. One is the go to plan, the travel package.
mhm.
That has received a lot of money in the supplementary budget. So one of the criticisms there is that people are going to travel in any event. That they don't need that much more encouragement of the Japanese government paying, a quarter or half of their fees to encourage them to go. But it does encourage a certain amount of more travel, and so that's it. It's one of the problems with um, government doing anything. And the problem is in the United States as well. If the government does it, it costs more money. It still generates some sort of a benefit. But the argument is, why don't you let the private industry take care of these things and maybe make the money available to the private sector so that they can come up with their own ideas. It probably has a better um, revenue generation than having the government do it, who kind of do it with a heavy hand with less insight or creativity. And you might that might be the case here with the go-to travel, but also with regard to companies getting the money. I think the Japanese government knows, especially for restaurants and hotels, they're really in trouble, and they don't want them to go bankrupt. So they're making these loans more available in the hopes that yes, they will pay back this money almost dollar for dollar. They'll pay it back without too much of an interest, and push it from 5-year payback to 7-year payback, maybe even 10-year payback. But that's, I think, the way they prompt the economy up. People are always amazed, just as you mentioned it, how Japan has such a huge debt. But you come here and it looks nice. Companies are in business. The streets are clean. There's no crime. Very little poverty hits the eye. So it is something of a real a mystery for most people.
Yes, the Japanese phenomenon. And you mentioned go to travel, so I wonder whether you have heard anything about the border closures or openings, if you wish, because initially they were talking, they said, the government said that they were going to keep the borders closed, until the end of December.
That's right.
And now there is some talk about actually postponing the opening.
That's right. Well, I think we all anticipated that until December 31st, there would be no change. And that still stands pat. The question is, when are they going to open things up again? And so I think they're evaluating this new variant and how it's coming out. There are a couple of new developments, too. You might have heard that there's an oral drug that was approved on Friday, and the Japanese government has purchased these. There are two new drugs that are out on the market. One is produced by Merck, and the other one is produced by Pfizer. The Pfizer drug has been in use in Europe and has received FDA approval. It hasn't been approved in Japan. Merck came out a little bit earlier. It has gone through lots of trials, and it has a bit of a track record, and the Japanese government just approved it now. So they've ordered several million distribution for what you might call first responders, nurses and paramedics and doctors, that sort of thing, will be distributed from Monday, from tomorrow. And then that pill over the counter will be available probably February, March timeframe. But they are really kicking that into gear. So even in light of COVID and the variants that we might be attacked with, it turns out that it is not as deadly, although it's more virulent. It spreads faster, but it is not as deadly. And the new oral drugs are very effective in keeping people out of the hospitals. They're not going to die if they take the pill. They're probably not even going to go to the hospital if they've consumed the pill, even with the new variant. So that's some good news that's coming up. But the strategy is to live with what we have, even in light of other variants. The hospitals will be bolstered. The new vaccines will be developed and supplemented by oral drugs too. So I think probably as we move into January, that will become much clearer. With the diet coming in on the 11th of the month, I think that will be one of the first items of business is opening up the borders. So I don't think you're going to hear anything before the 11th. And even after the 11th, it's going to take a little bit of time for the diet to get up to speed on current affairs and what the science is telling them. But I think in pretty quick order, you're going to see Japan getting back to business.
Oh, I definitely hope so. And I've got a question via the back channel. So the question is, what is the primary reason for a 2.5-year absence of ambassador to Japan until now?
Okay, well, I've been kind of busy. They keep calling me, but
Right, yeah.
Well, first of all, they had the second in command, Joe Young, was the number 2 in the embassy under William Haggerty. He's well known, he's well liked, and he was the charge. He was the ambassador without portfolio in the absence of the ambassador. And although he didn't get to live in the big house, he was doing a great job. Plus, we had the Trump administration going into the new election period, and then it failing, and then Joe Biden. So I think probably Mr. Trump had a hard time trying to find somebody who would come in to be ambassador to Japan to fill that role without the security of knowing that he's going to be repeated in another 4 years. So somebody who's going to become ambassador to Japan, giving up their position to come to Japan and not having a guarantee that it's going to be at least 4 years. That's at least what Bill Haggerty had. Bill Haggerty had, give up what you're doing in Tennessee, come to Japan. You've got 4 years to build your reputation and polish off your image and, do something good, and then go back to the United States and parlay that experience into something bigger. When he leaves halfway through and you've only got 2 years, you're going to think about that unless you're really, really confident that the person who is appointing you is good for another 4 years. So you got a 6-year ride. So I think that was part of it. And the other part of it is that after Trump, now you've got Mr. Biden. And I think he could have appointed an ambassador earlier, but as experience has shown us, the Senate was not in a position to pass it because they're so mad at Biden. They're Democrats and Republicans. It's almost a religious hatred of each other. So if the president wants to appoint an ambassador, there's a very narrow margin. It's almost 50-50. The Democrats have a certain majority with the vice president carrying a vote as well. Not everybody liked even Rahm Emanuel. So I think it was hard even to get him approved. They did because Build Back Better is kind of on the rocks here, and so I think the Democrats and the Republicans have shifted their focus to getting more business done and not so much of the political fight for the Build Back Better bill. But that's only my assessment of that. But it has been a long time. I hope that is responsive.
Yes, I hope so too. So if not, Hiroko, please let me know. And then, you also mentioned, I'm going back a little bit about, the internal, or let's say the factional fights in the LDP. And you mentioned that there will be a fight, obviously, between Mr. Kishida and Mr. Abe and Mr. Hayashi and Mr. Abe about, let's say, power balance. But I also wonder how big the impact of that struggle will be on national policies, and public policies here in Japan.
Great question. So because the LDP is so central to how politics and how policy is determined, anything that happens within the LDP is of importance. And that's why we focus a lot on it. There are some commentators in Tokyo, like Dan Harada, who focus exclusively on the LDP in his breakfast briefings. So the LDP is the party to watch. And the problem here with Hayashi and Mr. Abe is it's mostly, it's not just pride. I think Mr. Hayashi is determined, and I think he probably has a good chance to become prime minister at some point in his career. I mean, that's the whole reason why he shifted from the upper house to the lower house. He is extremely popular in Yamaguchi. His family and his heritage is far broader and far deeper than the Abe family. So I think going toe to toe, probably Hayashi is going to do better. Mr. Abe has, the attributes that he was the longest serving prime minister. He's got incredible power. He's got the Abe faction. So it is kind of a coin toss that you don't want to see this kind of internal fight developing, because the party itself will fracture. So I think that's the reason. There is some idea that this is not going to come into a huge fight until there is an election called. So the gerrymandering is directed to occur in the spring of this year. It doesn't mean that Mr. Hayashi or Mr. Abe have to give up their seat. They will have to give up their seat when there is an election, when Mr. Kishida closes down the diet, or there's a vote of no confidence or something. But I think as it stands right now, he looks pretty strong. The administration is moving smoothly forward. And so he will probably serve out his first term without too much of an incident, and he'll probably succeed himself into a second term. Mm-hmm. There could be a lot more going on between now and then, but right now that's the current prognosis. So the fact that Mr. Abe and Mr. Hayashi have to go toe to toe is not going to come up until there is a election of the lower house. So it could be that either Mr. Hayashi or Mr. Abe change houses. They go from the lower house to the upper house in this next election. If Mr. Abe went for the upper house in the next election, certainly he would win. Mr. Hayashi could do the same thing, but it's ridiculous if he did that, because he just left the upper house in order to go to the lower house in order to eventually become prime minister. But I think pride being what it is, and I'm not going to do that in order to preserve your political position. I think there's some of that going on. So it does remain to be seen what the solution is going to be. And the fact that they just forget about it. They say, we know that the Supreme Court said that we are in a state of unconstitutionality, but I think for Yamaguchi District 3 and District 4, it's okay to kind of smooth it over for the next election cycle. They've floated that trial balloon. I didn't see that it got a lot of press coverage. It got press coverage in the medias that I follow, but I think there's more to be seen. I think the story was clouded by other things going on within the diet, that it didn't receive the press that it deserves. Or maybe the pronouncement of Mr. Hosokawa was not as clear that people could throw darts at it. But it is a story that is going to have rather long legs on it, I predict.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm still, okay, please forgive my ignorance because I'm still learning. But you mentioned that there is a possibility that Mr. Abe goes into the upper house. If he does that, is it going to influence the range of his power? Because obviously he is one of the most powerful politicians at the moment. So I wonder how, he's going
No,
to.
it doesn't impact his power base. I
Mhm.
think he will be the same individual in the upper house or in the lower house. He is the faction head of the largest political faction, so he has that going for him. But I think it's more a matter of pride,
Mhm.
um, and it's also a matter of keeping. I think he's got 98 members in his faction to keep that number high. And coming in number 2 and number 3 is Mr. Aso's faction and Keisekai, um, the former Takeshita faction, are much lower. They're probably around in the high 70s. So I think he's still going to maintain that large number of members within his faction. They don't always vote as a block, but I think when it's important, he could um, pretty much convince his faction to vote in a certain way. He didn't utilize that in the election of prime minister, but that's one of the beauties of having a faction is this block voting. But I think, yeah, I think he would be basically untouched politically as a member of the upper house or as the lower house. I think it's more of a face and just pride. That's my take on it.
One more question before, I let you go. So you mentioned that
You're so kind.
thank you for appreciating my kindness. You talked about, what part of, the budget will be dedicated or is dedicated anyway to defense. And so I wonder whether it has something to do with, I mean, we usually say defense in general, but, if you have some insight into what, they actually intend to spend the money on, like, is it, let's say, research, or is it, upgrading of the infrastructure they have, or because we know that, of course, in the Indo-Pacific, there is an increasing, let's say, there is a trend of increasing tension between
Right.
China and the other countries with regards to Taiwan and also supply chains. So if you.
Okay. So this is a great question, Maya. I'm not fully competent to respond to it. Maybe I will bone up on it so that we can talk a little bit more fruitfully about it in our next January 2 room. But what's going on here, it reflects back to the Russians and the Chinese sailing through the Tsugaru Straits a couple of months ago. And the Russian President Putin has begun saying, I want to conclude this peace treaty between Japan and Russia because it's been going on for too long, and it's ridiculous that we have this standing in between us. And I would like for us to develop the relationship far more fruitfully than we have considered in the past. And the reason for him saying that obviously concerns the Northern Territories, the 4 islands in the Northern Territories that is basically the source of the dispute between Russia and Japan. The islands were invaded very quickly at the end of World War II. And Japan has always said, now that the war is over, why don't you return those islands to us? And the Russian argument is they used to belong to us. You guys took them over. And then we retook them as a consequence of the spoils of war. So you signed the peace treaty with everyone else. The war ended, so go to hell. These are our islands. That's the kernel of the argument. With the Chinese and the Russians sailing through that strait now, the United States and Japan are very concerned. There's been things going on with China and Russia in the recent past. I mean, recent meaning over the last 4 months or so, that causes the United States to be wary of not only Okinawa and the southern islands, but also the northern islands as well. Because if Russia and China join hands in an incursion sponsored by China to overtake Taiwan, Japan is going to be vulnerable if they're not capable in the north to the degree that they are in the south. So now you begin to see that they need to have military forces stationed in the northern part of Honshu and on Hokkaido to not the same degree, but to a degree representative of what they have in the South as well. So that's one of the reasons. And there is this, I think Stephen Nagy got into, is he speaking tomorrow, by the way?
Yes, he is.
Okay. So whoever has posed the question, maybe this is something that Stephen can address a little bit more eloquently tomorrow night, but the joining of forces, the potential joining of forces of Russia and China against the United States and the Western countries is a prospect that is not very attractive. So I think that's one of the reasons why the defense budget needed to be supplemented. But also, I think the Japanese just, they're becoming more and more concerned and more vulnerable due to the fact that they must rely on the United States for offensive capabilities, and they want to change that dynamic very, very quickly. So, 11% increase, it's pretty huge, actually.
Yes, it is. Okay.
By the way, before you wrap up the room, you have a room every Thursday,
Yes.
Thursday morning. Ren was on the room this last Thursday talking about the Philadelphia Philharmonic. It was a great conversation. Ren, I see that you're in the room. That was a really insightful conversation. And your Thursday, you frequently have guest speakers that come up. It's not a regular, it's more of a catch-all. Is that right?
Yes.
It's always a really interesting and just a great room on Thursdays. And also, before I change subjects yet again, in our particular room, Maya, we generally have about 100 people that hit the room, and then they hear my voice, and then they sign off. That's maybe 30% of them. But we do have about 60 people who kind of continually listen in. And so every time we have a room, it's about 60 people who listen in. But since you've posted these on YouTube, and then you post them on Japan Expert Insights, there are people who will never show up in this room in physical form, but they listen to these postings on your webpage or elsewhere, and
Yes.
that number is beginning to climb as well, isn't it?
It is, yes. It is increasing. So obviously, yeah, we are gathering traction, and that's the good news. So thank you very much for mentioning it.
Thank you very much for everything in 2021, Maya. Thank you for encouraging me to do this room with you. I think it's been a great experiment, great exercise. I've learned a lot from it, and I've really enjoyed being with you every week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here, for preparing for the room. I know that it's not easy. It requires a lot of your time. It's very much appreciated. So, and I'm looking forward to what is to come in 2022.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was Japan Expert Insights Room on Japanese politics. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you!